Welcome to my very first theory video. This is based on Final Fantasy VII Remake, and this is my third Sephiroth theory video. And I'm not saying that I've made 3 Sephiroth videos, because I haven't yet. This is just my second. But I want to explain to you why I think that there are actually 3 distinct Sephiroths operating at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake. So welcome folks, I am Joe from Joe Thinks Art. This began as a Joe Thinks Gaming project, which I'll leave the link to my gaming channel in the description. And as I did research for it, it just evolved into a project that by the end of pre-production and stuff, I definitely wanted to do a piece of art for this. Now, while playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, I really enjoyed the retelling and the elaboration on each of the characters in like a modern storytelling sense. Like you really get a sense of how antisocial Cloud is, how insecure Tifa is without anyone saying anything, and Barrett's doubt, nobody ever mentions it, but you can read it right on his face. I even noticed that Sephiroth appears to even have more elaborate emotions too, and it appears to me it's distinctly different at the beginning and end of the game than in the middle. Now, before I go any further in this theory, I want to point out I am not going to pull any punches for theories. So you may want to play the game or be okay with the fact that I'm going to ruin some stuff related to Sephiroth for you to explain the way that I think that this theory works. Now that being said, I have done a previous Sephiroth video, and Sephiroth the monster, which we will get into in a moment here, with the incorporation of Jenova, was covered in that video, and there's some things that I am just going to brush right past, and I won't really be elaborating on, that is covered in that video, specifically about the relationship between Sephiroth and Jenova. Now, first thing, disclaimer, there's 3 major things that you have to keep in mind if you are a major Sephiroth lore canon follower that is a little different for this particular theory to work the way that I envision it to. The first is that Sephiroth makes Cloud the center of his focus basically right away, right after Cloud kills Sephiroth and he awakens in the life stream and begins dissolving some of his memories and stuff right away. That is when he makes Cloud the center of his existence, not towards the end of the actual game's canon, where Sephiroth is kind of scurrying to find ways to continue to exist and creates the remnants. The second is that there is an actual battle of wills between Sephiroth and Jenova, similar to the Battle of Wills that you encounter at the end of the full canon game where Sephiroth and Cloud, and they do it in the remake too, where they do that psychic battle. There's one between both Jenova and Sephiroth. And the third point that you have to keep in mind too, for this theory to kind of work, is that the way that Sephiroth's willpower overpowered Jenova was at the conclusion of the fight we just talked about a second ago. Sephiroth absorbs Jenova, and then begins taking on Jenova traits, and effectively blends the 2 personalities together. So Sephiroth, in and of himself, is a really, really popular character who kind of broke out of the standard bad guy mold for most video games. He transcended into other video games. He's a major player at the beginning of the Kingdom Hearts series. There's other games as well that include him as a bonus character and things like that. And then there's also the Final Fantasy VII Core Crisis Sephiroth, where, well, I would say Sephiroth won in my 3 distinct Sephiroths, but there was a man once before the monster. Sephiroth the man, created when Professor Hojo injected Jenova cells into the unborn fetus conceived by Vincent Valentine and Luceria, was born into the world as a Shinra experiment. Now, I elaborated more on his life at this time in the previous video. Like I said, there's a link in the description about that. But this Sephiroth was a hero, a war hero, and he rose to the ranks and met his end in insanity and was slain by Cloud in what is called the Nibelheim incident, where Cloud and Tifa's hometown was destroyed and all of the inhabitants were experimented on afterwards and injected with both Jenova and Sephiroth cells. Now, like anyone else, when Sephiroth died, even though he died by being thrown into Mako and giving his physical components access to not being absorbed by the life stream, and that's how they made it to the northern crater, his life force still returned to the life stream for processing. Now, as his willpower was enhanced by Jenova, and as such he chose to hang on to a memory within the life stream to retain his individuality, so that he could operate independently from within the life stream and not be absorbed by the planet. That memory, of course, was of Cloud. He wants Cloud to remember him as he was, his Sephiroth. That way he remains independent in the life stream, as I said. This does raise an interesting question. As I had said before, part of this theory is that Sephiroth can absorb things. Could he potentially gain power by absorbing some Mako? Physically. Which helps make it make more sense that what was left of Sephiroth's body was encased in materia at the northern crater, improcessable components of the life stream. Now, of course, that ends the story of Sephiroth the man, and begins the story of Sephiroth the monster. A sentient individual willpower within the afterlife, the life stream. Sephiroth the monster, created by dueling willpowers of Sephiroth and Jenova during the events leading up to the slaying of Aerith and the casting of the world-ending ultimate power meteor. So how did this monster come to be? There's some things we have to keep in mind, specifically as well for this theory, that all Jenova cells, any individual, no matter how small, piece of Jenova is subject to what Professor Hojo calls the reunion theory. Every single cell, regardless of where it is, wants to reunite with all of the other cells so that Jenova can be reborn, I would imagine. Now, Cloud's role in this is important to remember too, because during Cloud's time in captivity, leading up to the beginning of the original game, he's experimented on by Professor Hojo with both the regular Jenova cells and altered, specifically Sephiroth cells. Yet he transformed into neither, which was the common way of telling that that experiment was working. So Professor Hojo considers Cloud an absolute failure. So back to Sephiroth. Sephiroth wakes up dead in the life stream, yet able to identify himself independently of it, and feeling the pull of Jenova's reunion from within the life stream. Then, self-aware, he begins attaching himself to Cloud's memory to keep his individuality as he feels the life stream beginning to absorb him. It's actually an easy one if you think about it. It's the moment before he died. That was Cloud. That killed him, you know. Anyhow, so Sephiroth continues within the life stream and begins to sacrifice human memories. Specifically memories that are devoid of anything Jenova, strengthening his Jenova cell collection and strength of Jenova. This is very likely the time in which he begins to be able to remote view the surface through Sephiroth clones and then later Jenova clones, or Jenova cells in general. This would also be the time, you would imagine, that Sephiroth would begin experimenting with taking over Sephiroth clones, and we might have actually seen that happen in the Marco introduction in Final Fantasy VII Remake. That may have actually been Sephiroth trying to communicate with Cloud. Obviously, Sephiroth not yet powerful enough to have any influence over Cloud quite yet. Until that is when Cloud comes into proximity of Jenova's remains. Now Sephiroth, being able to exert his will over the remains, finds that both the reunion instinct and Jenova are far stronger than Sephiroth's willpower expected, and now poses a threat to Cloud and Sephiroth's willpower within the life stream in and of itself. This would be the point the mighty battle of wills happens between far more Jenova cells than Sephiroth's willpower was prepared for, and Sephiroth's willpower itself. What would such a battle look like? I'd like to see some of your guys' ideas about that. Why not leave a comment below and let me know? For me, the practical thing that Sephiroth could do to overcome and win a fight like this against Jenova, regardless of how powerful she is, because of his heritage and the way that he even exists in the first place, would be to just burn a ton of human memories and literally absorb what is Jenova. And in my theory, that is how he wins. He absorbs Jenova, effectively taking on her personality as well, blending Sephiroth the man with Jenova, creating Sephiroth the monster. So now Sephiroth has complete control over any of Jenova's remains or cells or anything else like that, and begins manifesting physical bodies in the overworld to interact with various different things. You know, when Sephiroth's willpower uses his newfound abilities to strengthen his memory within Cloud by attacking him repeatedly with Sephiroth-looking clones, sending messages and taunting Cloud and his team. Then, of course, everything goes from bad to apocalyptic when Cloud comes across Sephiroth's original remains in the northern crater, because Sephiroth is remote viewing through Cloud. It's at this point that Sephiroth's willpower concocts the Godhood plan. He's going to use the black materia to summon Meteor, and he's going to strike the planet at its newest wound, the city of Midgar. The life stream will rush to the city of Midgar to heal the wound, and Sephiroth, with his new god body created from his former remains, Jenova cells he has complete control over, and willpower, he will become a god by absorbing the life stream that's rushing to Midgar to heal the wound of the planet. Well, things don't exactly go to Sephiroth's willpower's plan. He does recover his physical body, he does end up getting a new body with his remains and his willpower in the Jenova cells. Unfortunately, when he casts Meteor to strike the planet, Aerith ends up casting Holy, causing him to go on the defensive and move his physical body to the core of the planet, where Holy would actually originate from, and to contain it there. Now, this is the moment, of course, that Sephiroth's willpower uses one of the Jenova cell versions of himself to kill Aerith. But luckily she gets the spell off beforehand, thus causing Sephiroth, like I said, to go on the defensive and not be able to repair the barrier on the northern crater when Shinra strikes it with the Sister Ray, attempting to destroy Sephiroth. They have no idea how powerful he really is. Luckily, because of their actions, Cloud and his team are able to get down into the northern crater and defeat Sephiroth's physical form. Now, it's important to note that when Cloud and the other two teams defeat Safer Sephiroth and Holy is released out into the world to defeat Meteor, a tremendous amount of Sephiroth's physical form is destroyed in the rush of Holy being released from its containment, thus greatly weakening any possibility that Sephiroth's willpower has to use those cells in the future. Now, when Holy springs forth with the defeat of Sephiroth's physical form, it needs a specific distance. It actually acts like a shield around the planet, and Meteor has already come a little too close, having penetrated that distance. This is when Sephiroth's willpower uses the chaos of this moment to draw Cloud's consciousness into a battle of wills, like he did with Jenova earlier. Of course, Sephiroth's willpower loses to Cloud. However, this strengthens his presence within Cloud's memory once Sephiroth returns to the life stream. It's this moment that Sephiroth's willpower, upon returning completely to the life stream, he begins concocting the idea of just trying to manifest avatars on the surface, thus linking the Advent Children content in this theory as well. Now, of course, as the story goes, Aerith from the afterlife within the life stream uses her ability as the last Cetra to fulfill her destiny by assuming physical control over the entirety of the life stream. And with physical control, she reaches out with the life stream and pushes Meteor back a little bit, so it can safely dissolve on Holy, which is still up and running. It's at this point that Sephiroth uses the remaining free-floating Genova cells within the life stream from the death of his physical form and his full essence as Genova returning to the life stream to inflict geostigma on any who come in contact with the life stream while it's pushing Meteor away so that it can be destroyed. All that being said, this is the point at which Sephiroth's willpower is completely defeated, severely weakened, and exists only within the life stream again. Now, the collection of short stories On the Way to a Smile for Final Fantasy VII connects the game to the movie Advent Children that came out, and how Sephiroth's remnants, Kadaj and his brothers, come into existence is explained in an abstract Final Fantasy VII style way, but it also suggests that Sephiroth was not aware of what geostigma was going to mean to him, or maybe do for him, seeing as the book specifically says he thought he might amuse himself with it for a while, before realizing the power that he could draw from the people that died from geostigma. And as more people get sick and more people die, he grows in power, as you see. His willpower does. As those who die with hatred for the planet in their heart, their souls actually have Genova cells in them that help strengthen Sephiroth's willpower existing within the life stream. Even discovered by the living humans on the surface that geostigma is Genova cells disseminated through the destruction of Meteor. So Sephiroth grows in power until he can eventually use his willpower to manifest an avatar on the surface, but he nearly fails due to the inability to remember what he even physically looked like. He ends up drawing memories from within the life stream to manifest an avatar that looks similar to him with some of his characteristics, and the character from Advent Children, Kadaj, is born, and his sole purpose is to find any remaining Genova cells. Thus, Kadaj and his brothers are obsessed with finding Mother, as all that is left of Sephiroth is the Sephiroth Genova amalgamation that exists after he absorbs her. Of course, as I said, Kadaj has brothers, and Sephiroth, after manifesting his first avatar, realizes, oh yeah, the physical form's very limiting, and to find those cells we're going to need a couple more. All three share the same purpose. Find Genova cells. Find Mother. So let's just super spoil the whole plot of Advent Children, because Sephiroth's willpower uses Cloud's memories of him, the expanded presence of his avatar's successful reunion with all of the Advent Children in the movie that are infected with geostigma and activated as his clones, and Kadaj finally succeeding at getting Genova cells. Sephiroth is able to materialize a full and complete image true body of himself, which Cloud narrowly defeats. Lamenting any chance of victory for Sephiroth, Aerith casts Great Gospel from within the life stream that creates the healing pool in the church and severs the link of Genova cells in the life stream, effectively making geostigma nothing and healing anyone who was injured. Leaving Sephiroth's willpower, again severely weakened and defeated, continues to exist in the life stream, unable to influence the world of the living whatsoever, and only existing because of Cloud's memory. Thus ends Sephiroth the Monster. From here, continuity says that Sephiroth's willpower is only strong enough to continue to exist and is no longer a threat. I say, what happens when Cloud dies? Sure, the Great Gospel Rain cleared up geostigma, but it never suggests that it cures Genova cells in and of itself. What if Cloud's Genova and or Sephiroth cells remained? Sephiroth told Cloud that he was alive in his memory, and it would make natural sense that Cloud would spend his lifetime building his mental shields to become more and more powerful. Thus, Sephiroth is incapable, no matter how powerful he becomes, unless some other unknown circumstance flies in. He would never be able to take control of Cloud or exert his will on the surface again. This would, however, have a secondary effect of also making sure that Sephiroth continues to exist, because he's remembering him. I also like to think of what a future like this might be like, where Cloud goes around and rounds up all the remaining Jenova cells and destroys them in the pool at the church, trying to completely rid the world of Jenova. Perhaps Cloud would incorporate the special water at the church into the fusion blade or additional weaponry for Denzel. I like to even think that Sephiroth's willpower doesn't just give up and not do anything, but makes several new attempts to exert himself on the surface. However, all fail thanks to Aerith's continued existence within the life stream. I also like to think, what if Aerith and Minerva, the goddess of the life stream from Final Fantasy VII Core Crisis, what if they combined forces to be sure that Sephiroth was never going to exert his will on the surface again? As many of you know, I'm a Team Tifa player, so I also like to envision a future where the two of them end up together, where Tifa maybe becomes the mayor of Edge, Marlene grows up and takes over the Seventh Heaven. Maybe Cloud continues Cloud Strife delivery service, and actually it evolves and morphs into a large global mailing system. What if together Cloud and Denzel, his son, help establish a new monster slayer organization and people never live in fear in their world again? Regardless of how we get there, though, and for this theory to work, Cloud eventually dies of old age. I imagine, of course, before Tifa. And with the return of the Jenova cells and Sephiroth's specific clone cells housed within Cloud, Sephiroth's willpower would strike Cloud immediately. Of course, Cloud defeats Sephiroth over and over as his soul is shielded by Aerith from dissolving into the life stream, thus making it effectively last forever. In this idea, in this theory, Aerith comes to realize that Sephiroth isn't really just trying to burn Cloud into the life stream and dissolve Cloud into nothing. Sephiroth is trying to die himself by getting rid of Cloud. With no Cloud, there is no Sephiroth. In this theory, when confronted, Sephiroth agrees that is what he is doing. Cloud, ready to put an end to Sephiroth once and for all, asks Aerith to stop protecting him so that both he and Sephiroth can dissolve into the life stream. Jenova's willpower, however, waiting all this time until Sephiroth's willpower is no longer strong enough to control her, then takes control of both Cloud and Sephiroth's remnants. I think here it would actually make the most sense if Jenova then used Sephiroth's abilities and forced Sephiroth to absorb Cloud to consolidate their power. However, there could be an alternate here where this doesn't happen and the two are locked in eternal combat within the life stream until the very end of the planet. However, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Combined, Cloud and Sephiroth's willpower could mentally attack Jenova and gain an upper hand. But what would remain after the battle is an amalgamation of Cloud and Sephiroth, living with independent Jenova cells within the life stream, no longer strong enough to exert control over anything yet still. That hasn't changed. Which would leave a remnant of Aerith to watch over this wound in the life stream for the remaining days of the planet, which eons would pass and the natural end of the planet's life would approach. The star would consume the planet, taking the remnant of Aerith and the life stream with it, and the Jenova cells containing the willpower of Cloud and Sephiroth would live on, leading to the passing of an eternity where an elderly universe approaches the end of its life, an event known as the Big Crunch, which precedes a Big Bang. Through this eternity, Sephiroth's willpower would be all that remains in the ancient, dormant Genova cells, guided by an idea of Cloud. Seconds at the end of the universe, before the end of everything, Sephiroth's willpower uses newfound powers to find its way into a new afterlife, perhaps called the Fate Stream, if you will, and begins traversing alternate realities, trying to find one where he can prevent his fate. So let's summarize this. There's a third Sephiroth from a future timeline that is seconds away from oblivion in his timeline, riding the tides of fate, or the Fate Stream, if you would, throughout alternate timelines, trying to find one he can remain persistent in, or change so that perhaps his fate doesn't end this way. Perhaps this third Sephiroth wishes the return of his Cloud self, as I had said earlier, and is traversing these timelines, gathering enough fate energy, per se, by absorbing Whisperers and gaining strength to move to yet another world if he doesn't succeed, and still yet again trying to both find his Cloud self and find a world he can stay persistent in with his Cloud self. But this also suggests that he may be defeated time and time again in various alternate timelines where Cloud just does not come on board with Sephiroth's plan. So what do you think? This theory poses a lot of interesting new questions that could be addressed in future installations of the Final Fantasy Remake series, or completely debunked, which either way is true. But this is currently the way I kind of see it, that there was Sephiroth the man, there was Sephiroth the monster, and then there was Sephiroth the Cloud, or the third Sephiroth, so to speak. And that this Sephiroth has a different intention, but is encouraging the changing of fate. So if you like this kind of content, definitely hit that like button and let me know, and I'll keep making stuff like this. If you haven't yet, subscribe and hit the notification bell, and you will be notified when I release new videos. This will probably be the only video I release for June of 2020. It has been a crazy ride so far this year. So remember, folks, be kind to one another and use your turn signals.